In the shadowed corridors of history, certain figures loom, their legends grotesque yet profoundly revealing of the human condition. Imagine a queen, seized by religious fervor, pledging to forgo the changing of her undergarments until her holy war's triumphant conclusion. For almost a decade, Isabella of Castile, it is said, wore the same linen chemise, becoming a veritable walking miasma that would have repulsed even the most desensitized medieval sensibilities. This is more than a chronicle of neglected hygiene. It is a disturbing glimpse into the abyss of fanaticism, where piety spirals into obsession, and obsession births monstrosity. The woman destined to be known as Isabella the Catholic entered a world devoid of a unified Spain. Born in 1451, she found the Iberian Peninsula a fractured tapestry of Christian kingdoms and Muslim emirates, locked in an 8th century struggle that had claimed countless lives. The Reconquista, as it was termed, transcended a mere political campaign. It was a holy war that had defined generations. Isabella's arrival coincided with the waning years of this epochal conflict, yet she would emerge as its most formidable and controversial figure. Upon ascending to the Castilian throne in 1474, Isabella inherited not only a crown, but also a divine mission that would dictate her every action until her death. The young queen possessed a keen, almost unsettling intelligence, paired with a religious conviction that verged on the pathological. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was not a union of love, but a calculated act of statecraft, uniting two of the peninsula's most powerful Christian kingdoms. Together, they would forge an unparalleled weapon against the Muslim presence in Granada, a weapon fueled by faith and ruthlessness. The grim tale of Isabella's unwashed undergarments originates, according to historians, from a moment of carefully staged religious zeal. In 1482, as she prepared to launch the final assault of the Reconquista against the Emirate of Granada, the queen purportedly made a solemn vow before her assembled court and clergy. She swore by the Virgin Mary that she would not change her chemise, the linen garment worn closest to her skin, until the last Muslim stronghold had fallen to Christian dominion. This began as a visible symbol of pious resolve, but soon morphed into something deeply disturbing and symbolic of her reign. Medieval hygiene, even for the privileged, was rudimentary by modern standards. Yet, even within the context of the 15th century, Isabella's pledge was extreme. The wealthy typically changed their linen undergarments weekly, the poor perhaps monthly. But a decade? Court chroniclers began to document the transformation of the queen from a radiant young ruler into a figure inspiring both reverence and disgust. The chemise, once as white as pristine snow, gradually acquired the yellowish-brown hue of accumulated sweat, blood, and other bodily excretions. As the years passed, the queen's self-imposed penance began to manifest in ways extending far beyond mere unpleasantness. Court physicians, couching their observations in cautious language to avoid royal displeasure, recorded the appearance of persistent skin irritations and what they delicately described as corruptions of the flesh. The perpetual friction of soiled fabric against skin produced open sores that resisted healing. These wounds, in turn, became fertile grounds for bacteria and parasites, thriving in conditions unimaginable even in that era of limited sanitation. The psychological ramifications for Isabella herself were no less profound. Contemporary accounts depict a gradual shift in her demeanor as the siege of Granada dragged on. The queen, previously known for her diplomatic acumen and reasoned approach to governance, began to exhibit behaviors that modern psychologists might classify as obsessive-compulsive. She became fixated on ritual purity in all aspects of her life, except for this glaring, paradoxical exception, creating a cognitive dissonance that manifested in increasingly erratic and, at times, brutal decision-making. The courtiers in Isabella's service during this period found themselves trapped in a bizarre tableau of etiquette and endurance. Protocol dictated proximity to their sovereign during audiences and ceremonies. Yet the overpowering stench emanating from the queen became so intense that many developed chronic respiratory ailments. Visiting dignitaries from other European courts returned home with whispered tales of the Spanish queen who reeked of a charnel house. The siege of Granada itself mirrored Isabella's internal state, evolving into a protracted, almost obsessive campaign that consumed resources and lives with ruthless abandon. What might have been achieved through diplomacy or a swift military campaign became a grinding, decade-long war of attrition that seemed to transform the queen into something less than human. Her religious advisors, recognizing the psychological grip that the vow held, dared not suggest that God might release her from such an extreme commitment. Islamic sources from Granada describe the Christian queen in terms that blurred the lines between military strategy and supernatural horror. To the defenders of the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, Isabella had become a living embodiment of Christian fanaticism, a woman so consumed by hatred for their faith that she had allowed her own body to fester in service of their annihilation. These accounts, while undeniably influenced by the propaganda needs of a desperate siege, offer a chilling glimpse into how the Queen's vow had acquired almost mythic proportions. As the siege entered its final years, even Isabella's closest allies began to express private anxieties about the long-term consequences of her condition. Cardinal Mendoza, her most trusted advisor, wrote in veiled correspondence about his fears that the Queen's deteriorating physical state might be clouding her judgment in matters of state. He recounted witnessing Isabella scratching compulsively during council meetings, leaving bloody welts on her arms and neck that remained visible for days. The prevailing medical understanding of the time linked physical corruption with spiritual corruption, creating a dangerous feedback loop within Isabella's psyche. The more her body deteriorated, the more convinced she became that she was being tested by God, requiring ever more extravagant displays of faith and commitment. This mindset would prove catastrophic for the non-Christian populations of Spain, as the Queen's personal obsessions began to translate into increasingly violent policies. The Queen's physical state also had devastating consequences for those closest to her. Her ladies-in-waiting, obligated to assist in dressing and undressing their sovereign, were exposed daily to the consequences of her vow. Several developed chronic illnesses that court physicians attributed to corrupted humors emanating from the royal presence. Modern medical understanding suggests these women likely suffered from respiratory infections, skin conditions, and possibly parasitic infestations transmitted through close contact with Isabella's contaminated clothing. The psychological ordeal extended beyond mere physical discomfort. Isabella's insistence on maintaining the facade of normalcy meant that courtiers were forbidden from acknowledging the obvious reality of her condition. Those who displayed any sign of revulsion or discomfort in the Queen's presence faced immediate banishment, or worse. This created an atmosphere of enforced denial that permeated the entire court, where sensory evidence was suppressed in favor of royal protocol. When Granada finally fell on January 2, 1492, after almost a decade of siege, Isabella's moment of triumph was intertwined with her greatest personal horror. Contemporary accounts describe the Queen's chemise as having virtually fused with her skin in places, requiring the careful intervention of physicians to remove it without causing severe injury. The fabric had become so saturated with bodily fluids and so thoroughly colonized by bacteria that it had begun to decompose at the molecular level, creating a second skin of corruption. The immediate aftermath of the vow's completion revealed the true extent of the damage Isabella had inflicted upon herself. Physicians discovered extensive scarring, chronic infections, and what appeared to be early indications of septicemia, which would plague her for the remainder of her life. The Queen's immune system had been so compromised by years of exposure to her own waste products that she became vulnerable to every minor ailment that swept through the court. Her recovery would take months, during which she remained largely secluded from public view. Yet, even as Isabella underwent the agonizing process of physical rehabilitation, she was simultaneously orchestrating some of the darkest chapters in Spanish history. The Alhambra Decree, issued only 3 months after Granada's fall, presented Spain's Jewish population with a terrible choice: conversion to Christianity or expulsion from their ancestral homeland. This act of ethnic and religious cleansing displaced hundreds of thousands of people who had called Iberia home for over a millennium, creating a refugee crisis that rippled across the Mediterranean world. And the Spanish Inquisition, formally established under Isabella's authority in 1478, reached its most terrifying peak in the years following Granada's conquest. The same obsessive religious fervor that had driven the queen to maintain her gruesome vow now manifested in systematic torture, confiscation of property, and mass executions. The autos Deus, public burnings of alleged heretics, became regular spectacles in Spanish cities, with Isabella herself attending these events as acts of religious devotion. The connection between Isabella's personal extremism and her policies was not lost on contemporary observers. Foreign ambassadors noted that the queen, who had subjected herself to such physical degradation, seemed incapable of recognizing the suffering she inflicted on others. The same mindset that viewed her rotting chemise as a badge of spiritual honor also viewed the torture chambers of the Inquisition as instruments of divine justice. The irony of Isabella's crusade for religious purity becomes even more stark when considering the broader context of her reign. While she was systematically purging her kingdom of non-Christians, she was simultaneously financing Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. The same treasury that funded the Inquisition's reign of terror also supported the expedition that would bring Christianity to the Americas through conquest, enslavement, and cultural annihilation. Columbus himself left conflicting accounts of his interactions with the Queen during the negotiations for his voyage. While he lauded her vision and determination, his private journals contain veiled allusions to the peculiar atmosphere of the royal court. Some historians have speculated that the navigator's well-documented nervous disposition during his time in Spain may have been related to the unsettling experience of conducting business in Isabella's presence during the final years of her vow. The financing of Columbus's expedition also reveals the cold arithmetic of Isabella's reign. The gold and valuables confiscated from expelled Jewish families and condemned heretics provided a substantial portion of the funds needed for the voyage. In essence, the same religious fanaticism that led to Isabella's physical self-destruction also enabled the economic mechanisms that would reshape the global balance of power for centuries to come. The psychological profile that emerges from Isabella's actions during this period suggests a ruler whose judgment had been fundamentally compromised by her extreme religious practices. The same obsessive-compulsive tendencies that prevented her from changing her undergarments also manifested in her inability to moderate her policies toward religious minorities. Every decision became a test of faith rather than a matter of practical governance. The court culture that developed around Isabella's extremism created a self-reinforcing cycle of escalating fanaticism, and nobles and clergy competed to demonstrate their piety through increasingly elaborate and painful displays of faith. Self-flagellation became commonplace among court officials, while extreme fasting and sleep deprivation were viewed as signs of spiritual advancement. The Queen's decaying chemise became the gold standard for religious devotion, inspiring imitators throughout the Spanish nobility. The long-term health consequences of Isabella's vow extended far beyond her personal suffering. The chronic infections she developed appear to have affected her reproductive health, contributing to multiple miscarriages and the death of several children in infancy. The Queen, who had sacrificed her body for the conquest of Granada, ultimately compromised her dynasty's future stability, as the succession crisis following her death in 1504 would plunge Spain into decades of political turmoil. The legend of Isabella's undergarments has been sanitized and romanticized over the centuries, transformed from a tale of pathological obsession into one of noble sacrifice. Spanish nationalist historians have portrayed the vow as evidence of the Queen's unwavering commitment to her people and faith. This revisionist narrative conveniently omits the documented suffering of both Isabella herself and the countless victims of her religious policies. Modern medical analyses of the surviving contemporary accounts suggest that Isabella's condition may have contributed to the spread of various diseases throughout her court and potentially beyond. The combination of chronic infections, poor hygiene, and close contact with numerous courtiers and visiting dignitaries created ideal conditions for the transmission of bacterial and parasitic diseases. Some epidemiologists have even speculated about potential links between court outbreaks during this period and Isabella's deteriorating physical state. The psychological impact of Isabella's extremism extended to her immediate family, particularly her children. Her daughter Joanna, later known as Joanna the Mad, displayed symptoms of severe mental illness that some historians have attributed to the traumatic environment of her mother's court. Growing up in an atmosphere where physical self-destruction was celebrated as spiritual achievement may have contributed to Joanna's subsequent psychological breakdown and inability to govern effectively. The religious establishment of the time found itself in an increasingly precarious position regarding Isabella's vow. While they had initially blessed her commitment, the obvious deterioration of her physical and mental health created theological dilemmas. How could they condemn her extremism without undermining the very foundations of the religious war they had spent decades promoting? The solution was a careful balancing act of public praise and private concern that characterized much of the late medieval church's approach to lay mysticism. Foreign courts observed Isabella's descent into obsession with a mixture of horror and fascination. The French court, traditionally Spain's rival, exploited accounts of the Spanish queen's condition as propaganda against Spanish power and influence. English observers writing for Henry VIII depicted Isabella's court as a cautionary tale about the perils of religious extremism. These international perspectives offer valuable insights into how Isabella's personal choices affected Spain's diplomatic relations. The economic costs of Isabella's obsessions were equally staggering. The resources devoted to the prolonged siege of Granada, funded in part by the proceeds of religious persecution, represent one of history's most extravagant acts of royal vanity. Economic historians estimate that the decade-long campaign cost approximately equivalent to 50 years of normal royal revenue, creating debt burdens that would haunt Spain for generations. The cultural legacy of Isabella's reign reflects the same unsettling contradictions embodied in her personal vow. She is simultaneously revered as the architect of Spanish unity and condemned as the architect of Spanish intolerance. The same resolve that drove her to endure a decade of physical degradation also drove her to create institutions and policies that would define Spanish identity for centuries. The Inquisition outlived her by over 3 centuries, while the expulsion of Jews and Muslims created cultural and economic scars that Spain has never fully healed. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Isabella's court has provided disturbing corroboration of contemporary accounts. Excavations at royal residences used during the Granada campaign have unearthed evidence of widespread disease, poor sanitation, and what appear to be systematic attempts to conceal underlying health problems through the use of heavy perfumes and incense. The material culture of Isabella's court reflects a society in profound denial about its own dysfunction. The influence of Isabella's example on subsequent Spanish rulers cannot be overstated. Her grandson Charles V would inherit not only her territories, but also her conviction that personal suffering was integral to effective governance. The Habsburg dynasty's propensity for religious extremism and political inflexibility can be traced directly to the precedent established during Isabella's reign. The notion that a ruler should embody the faith through personal sacrifice became a defining characteristic of Spanish monarchy. The medical consequences of Isabella's vow also shaped her understanding of health and disease among her subjects. The queen, who had deliberately compromised her own immune system, displayed little sympathy for those suffering from plague, disease, or malnutrition. Her policies toward public health mirrored the logic that guided her personal choices. Suffering was divinely ordained, and attempts to alleviate it might interfere with God's plan. The international dimensions of Isabella's extremism become evident when examining diplomatic correspondence from the period. Ambassadors from other European courts wrote extensively about the difficulty of conducting normal diplomatic business in an environment dominated by the Queen's obsessions. The protocol requirements surrounding Isabella's condition created barriers to effective communication and negotiation that may have contributed to several diplomatic setbacks during this period. The technological and intellectual stagnation that characterized much of Isabella's later reign can also be linked to the atmosphere of extremism she fostered. Scientific inquiry, artistic innovation, and philosophical debate all require a degree of intellectual freedom that was incompatible with the rigid orthodoxy Isabella imposed. The same mindset that prevented her from acknowledging the obvious problems with her personal hygiene also prevented Spanish society from adapting to changing circumstances. The documentation of Isabella's condition by court physicians offers valuable insights into medieval medical understanding and its limitations. Their careful euphemisms and coded language reveal the constraints under which medical professionals operated in an environment where the patient was both sovereign and potentially dangerous. These records also demonstrate the beginnings of a more systematic approach to medical observation that would eventually contribute to the development of modern diagnostic techniques. The role of Isabella's confessors and spiritual advisors in perpetuating her destructive vow raises profound questions about the ethics of religious counsel. These men, who had daily access to the queen and could observe the obvious deterioration of her condition, chose to reinforce rather than moderate her extremism. Their correspondence reveals a calculated decision to prioritize political and religious objectives over their sovereign's health and well-being. The broader European context of Isabella's reign reveals how her personal extremism fit into larger patterns of religious and political upheaval. The late 15th century was a period of unprecedented change, marked by the discovery of the New World, the Protestant Reformation, and the emergence of new forms of political organization. Isabella's response to these challenges, doubling down on medieval forms of religious expression, ultimately left Spain ill-prepared to navigate the modern world. The environmental impact of Isabella's campaigns against Granada and religious minorities also warrants consideration. The forced displacement of experienced farmers, artisans, and merchants created economic disruption that contributed to soil degradation, urban decay, and technological regression in many parts of Spain. The same obsessive focus that defined her personal vow also blinded her to the long-term consequences of her demographic policies. As Isabella's health deteriorated in her final years, the gap between public image and private reality became increasingly difficult to conceal. Court artists were instructed to portray her in increasingly stylized and unrealistic ways, while public appearances became carefully choreographed performances designed to mask her obvious physical problems. The Queen, who had once embodied Spanish power and unity, had become a grotesque caricature of herself. The deathbed scene described by contemporary chroniclers provides a fitting conclusion to Isabella's tragic story, surrounded by the smoke of incense intended to mask other odors, attended by physicians who dared not speak frankly about her condition, and blessed by clergy who had enabled her self-destruction. The Queen died as she had lived in her final years, trapped by the consequences of her own extremism. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Isabella's legacy is not what she did to herself, but what her example authorized others to do in the name of faith and purity. The Inquisition's torture chambers, the expulsion of entire populations, and the destruction of centuries-old communities all flowed logically from the premise that physical and spiritual suffering were not only acceptable but necessary for the attainment of religious objectives. The Queen, who festered in her own chemise for a decade, established a moral framework that would justify centuries of institutionalized cruelty. The modern Spanish memory of Isabella reflects the same contradictions that defined her reign. She remains a figure of national pride, celebrated in monuments, street names, and popular culture, while the darker aspects of her legacy are carefully compartmentalized or ignored altogether. This selective memory mirrors the willful blindness of her own court, which chose to disregard the obvious reality of her condition in favor of maintaining comfortable illusions. The question of whether Isabella's vow was genuine religious devotion or calculated political theater may ultimately be less significant than its demonstrable consequences. Regardless of her motivations, the Queen's actions established a template for religious extremism that would permeate Spanish culture for centuries. The notion that faith demanded physical sacrifice, that purity necessitated the rejection of basic human needs, and that unity could only be achieved through the elimination of difference all stemmed directly from Isabella's example. Contemporary genetics research has sought to analyze DNA evidence from artifacts associated with Isabella's court, hoping to identify the specific pathogens and parasites that may have flourished in the environment she fostered. While the results remain preliminary, they suggest the presence of several bacterial strains that were resistant to the herbal remedies commonly used during the period. This research provides a scientific basis for understanding how Isabella's personal choices may have affected the health of everyone around her. The linguistic evidence from Isabella's reign also reveals the psychological impact of her extremism. New words and phrases related to religious purity, bodily corruption, and divine testing entered the Spanish lexicon during this period, many of which remain embedded in the language today. The very words used to describe faith, cleanliness, and social order still bear the imprint of Isabella's obsessions, demonstrating how deeply her pathology penetrated Spanish culture. The architectural legacy of Isabella's reign reflects the same contradictory impulses that defined her personal life. The magnificent palaces and churches constructed during her reign were intended to project power and piety, yet they were also built using wealth confiscated from persecuted minorities and labor extracted through increasingly oppressive taxation. The aesthetic splendor of these structures masks the violence and suffering that made their construction possible. The international scholarly assessment of Isabella has evolved considerably over the centuries, reflecting shifting attitudes toward religious authority, ethnic diversity, and women in power. Early modern historians writing within Catholic monarchies tended to emphasize her piety and resolve while minimizing the more disturbing aspects of her reign. Contemporary historians working within more secular frameworks have been far more critical of both her methods and their consequences. The psychological study of Isabella's case has contributed to modern understanding of how religious extremism can manifest in individual behavior and governmental policy. Her pattern of obsessive behavior, inability to moderate extreme positions, and insistence on public performance of private suffering all represent warning signs that contemporary observers have learned to recognize in other contexts. The queen who never changed her underwear has become a compelling case study in the pathology of power. The ultimate tragedy of Isabella's story may be that she achieved everything she sought while destroying everything she claimed to value. She unified Spain through the suppression of diversity, established Catholic supremacy through the abandonment of Christian mercy, and secured her legacy through actions that would ultimately undermine Spanish power for centuries to come. The queen who sacrificed her body for her faith created a kingdom that would sacrifice its soul for the illusion of purity. In the end, Isabella of Castile stands as a stark reminder of the dangerous allure of extremism and the devastating consequences of fanaticism unchecked by reason or compassion. Her putrid chemise, worn for nearly a decade in service of a holy war, became a symbol not of devotion, but of the corruption that inevitably ensues when human judgment is subordinated to abstract ideals. The Spanish queen who refused to change her undergarments reminds us that the distance between saint and monster is often measured not in intention, but in consequence, and that the most dangerous individuals in history are frequently those who believe most fervently in their own righteousness. So, as we've journeyed through the unsettling story of Isabella of Castile, it becomes clear that her tale isn't just about a historical figure's personal choices, but a potent reminder of how even the most fervent beliefs, when unchecked by empathy and reason, can lead to unimaginable consequences, both for ourselves and for others. It's a cautionary narrative about the seductive nature of extremism and the importance of remaining grounded in our shared humanity. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. What struck you most about Isabella's story? Do you see any parallels in the world today? Leave a comment below. I'm really interested in hearing your perspectives and answering any questions you might have. Let's get a conversation going. And if you found this exploration of history thought-provoking, please consider subscribing. That way, you won't miss out on future dives into the complex and often unsettling stories that shape our understanding of the world. Thanks for watching.